Good evening. My name is David Peterson. Don Baham asked me to substitute for him as his host for this show. So I agreed to that, and here I am. So I have as a guest tonight Joyce Lackie. She's the author of a book called I Don't Cry, But I Remember, and we're going to be talking a great deal about that book later. But right now, I would like to ask Joyce a few questions about her own upbringing and her life and how she got to the point of writing this book. So Joyce, would you describe your childhood and where you grew up and anything to do with that part of your life?
I grew up in central Illinois on a farm. I'm a farm kid. Was born in 1942, right in the middle of the Second World War. I'm the eldest of 3 daughters, and I would describe my childhood as not exactly idyllic, but pretty darn nice.
Okay. So now, you grew up on a farm. Your father was a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. What kind of crops did he grow? Was he corn and soybeans, or?
Well, at that time, they also grew a lot of oats.
Okay.
They were growing grains as well, but yes, much corn and not as many soybeans at that time. But later, soybeans became.
Okay. You did not have animals around the farm, or did you?
No, my uncle owned the farm next door to ours, and he kept animals, and my dad helped him, and he helped my dad, but we didn't have any livestock.
Okay, so did you have any responsibilities in terms of doing anything with the farm as a child, or?
I think girls growing up kind of want a little more responsibility than they get, you know.
Oh, really?
We could work in the house and we could help with the cooking and that sort of thing, but as we got older, we would love to have driven the tractors and pulled the plows and that sort of thing, and oh no, that was sort of frightened my mother.
Oh, really? So your mother was basically a housewife and took care of you kids, raised you kids. She did not have an independent job or anything, is that right?
She had been a teacher.
Okay.
Her mother had sent her to college for a 2-year degree, and so she had taught in the little one-room schoolhouse where I later went to school.
Oh, really? In the same school? Huh?
Mm-hmm, yep. And at that time, let's see, that would have been in the 1930s, and women teachers at that time, usually in rural areas, were housed with one of the families of the students, or at least one of the families that lived nearby the school.
Okay.
So that's how she met my dad. She was housed with their family.
Huh. Okay, so your father, was his father a farmer, or sort of a farming tradition in the family?
Yeah, his father was a farmer. I think all of those, I think clear back to my great-grandfather, they were all farmers. My great-grandfather, or it might have been great-great, came through from, we were Scottish, or his background is mostly Scottish, and he emigrated from Scotland in 1784, something like that. And then eventually one branch of the family found their way to Illinois. Another grandfather was a state representative. These were small communities, so you could rise to prominence, you know, fairly easily.
And so the farm in itself, how many acres was it roughly? Do you remember?
160.
160.
We still own it. My sisters and I still own it.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Is it still, someone farms it in the family, or you rent it out?
No, we have a contract. We have a renter,
Okay.
a family friend.
Right. And 160 acres, that sounds like the standard parcel. It was
It is.
the part of the homesteading thing. I don't know if that's how they got it or not, but now, so that was sufficient to support the family, right? The 160 acres.
It was. It was. Dad told me once when I was in college, I think, that he had thought about buying another 160, and it just didn't seem like the risk. He wasn't sure he wanted to take that risk. But between my uncle and him, we had the 320.
Okay. And how was your father as a father, as opposed to a farmer?
All 3 of us girls idolized our father, and I think that often happens with girls, but he was a very gentle, very caring person. He wasn't demonstrative or outspoken in terms of saying I love you or drawing you into conversations one-on-one, but he was just very caring, and he had a good sense of humor, and he was just a fun person to be around.
Well, that sounds quite nice, yeah.
It was, yes.
You were saying earlier there were some things about your childhood that you thought were maybe not ideal. I don't know, you want to pursue that with a little bit more? Or?
The only reason I wouldn't have said it was idyllic, well, two things. There was somewhat a lack of resources in terms of our education, because it was a small, we went to small schools, and in my high school there were 25 people in my graduating class, and that was after we had consolidated into the larger school in the nearby town. So in that sense, but you know, that's awfully well balanced by having an acreage to run around in and explore, right, and be independent.
So now, on that 160 acres, was there like a river, a stream, or pond, or anything like that that you kids could sort of fool around with? In other words, was it all farmed, or was some of it sort of left as a woodlot or whatever?
Yeah, there are only 132 tillable acres on that farm, so
okay,
there is a creek that runs through it, and you know, my sisters and I did go down there and play, but my memories of that are of exploring it by myself, and I think I thought I was an explorer. You know, I went all the way over to the next farm and crossed the road and went off into that area all by myself, and I was pretty intrepid.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think, to me, I've always thought that that would sound like a really great way to grow up, because you have that space available and sort of feel secure, and you can explore as you want, you know, unless your parents are sort of saying no, no, and all that. Speaking of your parents again, your mother, how was she as a mother?
Well, maybe that's one of the things I was thinking of. My mother was a fragile person, and her mother had recognized that, which is why her mother, who had to scrape together every penny, sent her to two-year normal school so that she could have a career to fall back on in case she didn't make a good marriage. And she just wasn't, the other two girls, her two older sisters, were tough farm women, and they would go out there and get that livestock in and whatever needed to be done. And I don't think she was sure my mother could do that. But my mother was fragile in another way, and that is that she was afraid to let us do things. That might be what I feel was holding me.
Okay.
If my 8th grade class got to go to Chicago on the train to go to the museums and the Brookfield Zoo, and I couldn't go because it terrified her.
Really?
And she was agoraphobic. We couldn't travel very much because she was afraid to go very far from home, that kind of thing.
Okay. But as far as you sneaking off to the stream in the woods, did you do it sort of behind her back, or
No,
did she know?
she wouldn't have cared about that. That was okay.
Okay, so she felt safe with that. Okay.
Just don't go too far.
Now, those one-room schoolhouse, actually my mother grew up in one of those, and it always, from her description, seemed like kind of a mixed blessing to me, because she said that even though there was one teacher trying to take care of 6 grades, that as the kids got older, they kind of helped the younger kids out, and sort of was, in a way, gave them a little more responsibility and a maturation process. And it certainly didn't seem to have damaged you in terms of your intellectual capabilities. How was that experience for you in a one-room schoolhouse?
I'm not sure the education I got there was any less fulfilling or less rigorous than the one I would have received had we consolidated to the larger town earlier. I went through 6th grades in that school.
Okay.
I don't remember the grades helping each other. Of course, each teacher is different.
Okay.
But I think the demands were fairly rigorous. It's just that there wasn't a broad perspective in that area at the time. So if I'd been in the town school, I might have had about the same education.
Okay. Now, do you think in terms of being aware of things culturally and other things that the school was limiting in that way, or that you, because it sounds like all the kids there probably were sons and daughters of farmers.
Right.
And so it would have been a fairly, in that sense, a fairly homogeneous or narrow kind of community in that way. Did you think of that later on as being an issue or a problem, or that never came up for you? I mean, of course, when you're a kid, you wouldn't be thinking about that. It's just in retrospect.
Yeah. Not so much, the division wasn't so much cultural. Well, in a way, there is a cultural division, because there are kids who come from and I don't know if it's just economic division, but there are kids who come from the families who own their farms, and those families are fairly stable. And then there are the kids who come from the farmers who are renting, and some of those are fairly stable, but also some of those, the kids aren't quite so nice. And so I decided that I was going to fix one little boy. I remember that as far as trying to figure out when I wanted to realize I wanted to become a teacher. And it might have been when this young boy, he was about 2 years younger than I was, I think, and his name was Gene. And when he came to visit, he would coax us to go around the house so he could show us his underpants and things like that, you know. So I wrote him a catechism. I explained all about Jesus and why you should believe this and why you should believe that. And I was going to get him all fixed up. So I think that might have been the beginnings of my wanting to be a teacher.
Okay. So you were raised in a fairly religious family then? Or?
Methodist. I wouldn't say they were fundamentalists, but it was yeah. My mother was pretty religious. My father too. Yeah, he just didn't go to church as much as she did.
Okay. So did you go to church every Sunday, or?
Oh, I have a pin that stands for 1 year perfect attendance and 12 bars for each successive year.
So that's pretty impressive. You never missed a Sunday school class.
Not unless I was sick.
Well, now, so you went on to high school, and it was a consolidated school. Did you get bused there, or how did that work?
We were bused. Mm-hmm.
But the one-room school, did you also get bused to that, or did you walk to that?
We walked. It was only a mile and a half away.
Only a mile and a half, okay. And I guess those must have been scattered all around Illinois, those little kind of farm.
They were. I don't know if ours was one of the last to consolidate or not.
Okay. All
that
right.
would have been, well, let's see, if I was in 6th grade, it would have been about 1950, I think.
All right. So, what was your high school experience like?
It's interesting being one of the farm kids when you come into town, you know, because I kind of palled around with a couple of other farm girls, but I never quite felt like I was part of the group of the kids who had grown up in town. But it never bothered me. I didn't necessarily want to, because even this day I cannot understand the concept of hanging out. I don't get it. They hung out.
Okay.
And I want to do something. So I didn't mind going home, strangely enough, and doing homework and coming back into town to sing in the choir, or coming back in to be in the Girls Athletic Association, or that sort of thing. But I was busy.
Okay. You kept yourself busy. You had things you wanted to do.
Yeah.
So you basically would go to school, and then as soon as school's over, you take the bus home. And there weren't like extra
Oh, if there were, if we stayed after for a club or something, then Mom would come and get us.
Okay.
It was about 5 miles to the town.
All right. And so what are the many things you were doing that you were so busy with?
Well, a lot of it was homework. By that time, I had gotten into the syndrome that it's important to get all A's, because it makes everybody happy. It makes you happy. It makes your parents happy.
Makes the school happy.
Yes.
Okay.
And besides that, I liked it. I liked what I was studying. I liked learning.
Right.
I liked even Latin. The other kids were complaining, and I thought, but it's interesting.
I took Latin too. I found it interesting, you know, and I think I'm like you that way too. Quite frankly, if I hadn't had to have a job, I think I would have liked to go into school my whole life.
I can understand that. I can relate to that.
Yeah. So, did you have any inkling at that point in your life about what kind of career you might have, or did that come later when you went to college, or what?
I think I'd figured that out by junior high, I think.
Oh, really?
But I didn't know which area. I loved math in high school, and I loved literature and writing. But it wasn't about my junior year, the math started to go faster than I did. Advanced algebra, I was keeping up, but it was with a lot of help from other students. We had study parties and
Okay.
yeah. So I said, okay, I think it'll be English.
All right. And so by the time you graduated from high school, you were more or less focused on English as being the direction you're going to go. And so you went to a college, I assume, somewhere in Illinois, or what?
The closest one to home, because that's as far as Mother could let us go.
Okay.
So it was 90 miles to the Illinois State Normal University, which later became Illinois State University. It was the teachers' college.
Is this somewhere near Springfield or Kankakee or something like that? Or?
Trying to think of the name of the little town. Oh,
Oh, it's not that
I know
important.
it,
It's
but-
not that
but
important. So it was
straight east of Peoria, about 40 to 45 miles,
Okay.
if that helps.
And was that a fairly small school or what?
When I was an undergraduate, it might have had 7,000 or 8,000. Later,
Okay.
I went back there to teach later. It had
Oh, you did?
10,000. So I'm thinking it was around 7,000 or 8,000 at that time.
Okay. So you majored in English, and then you took whatever necessary requirements there were for other courses, like, you know, math. Or any of the
Yes,
other
yes.
things. Okay.
But I loved that. I loved the general ed because the music appreciation class just opened my mind to. We didn't know what classical music was. We never heard it.
Never heard it.
Never, well, we had in one way. We sang in cantatas and that sort of thing in the church choir. So a little bit, we didn't realize that was classical music. You know, that, to us that was sacred music. But no, to hear Tchaikovsky, to hear Beethoven, and then to fit them into their movements and their times was those kinds of courses. Intro to sociology, those kinds of courses were fascinating.
Okay. Well, I know that now you do, you know, singing from time to time, and so that was something that obviously took naturally for you and became a part of your life later on.
I
too.
think kids who grew up singing in church choirs never lose
Oh,
it.
you sang in the church choir. Okay. All right. So at that point, you had settled on English, and you graduated. Now, did you? You went on for. I think you got a PhD. Is that true or not?
I got the master's first, and then
Master's.
taught for a while, and then got the PhD.
Okay. And where did you get your master's, at the same school? Or?
No, at that point, my mother was relaxing a little bit.
Okay.
I'd survived 3 years of college, so.
And she survived 3 years.
Yes, right. So they let me go on to the University of Illinois, which was another 60 miles maybe away in Champaign-Urbana for my master's.
All right. Well, I forget. Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about your younger sisters growing up. Did you all get along, or was that? Did you have a good relationship with them? Or?
I would say yes, we had a pretty good relationship. Even now, we have a good relationship. I had to share a bedroom with my middle sister, and that always irritated me because I like privacy. I guess that's why. Anyway, we had a perfectly good room across the hall, but Mother insisted on having a guest room, and so I could never just move
Even
into
though there was
that
no
room.
guest there.
Right.
Okay.
But yeah, we have a good relationship. In fact, after my mother's funeral, when the three of us came together to help Dad with her things and so forth, both my aunts were there, and they commented on, "We just don't understand how you three girls get along so well." We do. We all like each other.
Yeah, well, that's great. You think that you attribute that to something to do with your parents, or you themselves, you each individual just somehow clicked, or?
Oh, I think it's our parents. It was a calm family to grow up in. There wasn't a lot of yelling and screaming. There was respect. And so
Okay.
I think that it comes from, and concern for our educations. So that, and each one of us was important. So I think that's kind of the key right there.
Right, yeah. All right, so then you went to graduate for a master's degree, and you say you started teaching at that point, or shortly after that?
After I got the master's,
And
yeah.
that was teaching English at, what, a high school or a college, or?
I was quite lucky. The job market was wide open at that time for young people coming
That's
out of
the
college.
difference, isn't it?
Oh, my life would be so different if I were going into the workforce now. I landed my first job at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, which
Oh,
was
yeah.
a pretty prestigious university, and so
Yeah.
that was a good first year.
Okay. And so you were teaching undergraduate students just English lit, like novels and stuff like that, or writing, or
Introduction to composition, introduction to literature, those classes.
Okay. And you did that for a couple years, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went on for a PhD after that, then, or how did that work?
No, I actually, after the first year, went back and taught at Illinois State University for 2 years, because at that time I was engaged to a former history major he had gotten his degree, his master's at Illinois State while I was there. And then that relationship folded. We decided not to get married. So then I moved to New York, and I taught in upstate New York in Plattsburgh for 2 years, only an hour south of Montreal.
And how was your mother about that?
Well, by that time she was getting used to the idea that these kids just won't stay put.
They just won't stay where they're supposed
I know.
to. Okay, so you maintained a good relationship with her even after
Pretty good, yes,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
I mean, our stormiest years were our teen years, because I'm probably the boldest of the three of us girls, and I was always wanting to push the limits, and she had a hard time with that. It would have been hard to be my mother. I feel kind of sorry for her when I remember
Push
what I
the
wanted.
limit in what way? What do you mean by that?
I mean, what I wanted to do? Well,
is that what you meant by pushing the limit? You had your
I
own
wanted to
agenda.
do more than she wanted to let me do. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, like going to Chicago, or well, she let me join things. That was. But I wanted the whole family to travel. I just wanted, and I wanted to try things differently. For example, I came home from church camp at one point, and I discovered that people there didn't peel their tomatoes before they cut them up for salads. So I came home and I didn't peel the tomato. You'd have thought I had.
Oh,
I was just
this
getting
is
very lazy.
Oh, that's right. It wouldn't have been revolution. It would have been lazy.
Lazy,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so now, so you had several years of teaching before you went back to get a PhD.
Yes,
is that
because I
correct?
taught 2 years in New York, and then I went out to Colorado and started teaching out there. And I had taught in Colorado for several years before I decided to get the PhD.
And that was in Greeley, is that correct?
That's where I was teaching, University of Northern Colorado.
Okay, all right. So was it before you got your PhD or after you got your PhD that you felt you wanted to improve your Spanish, and how did that fit into the whole your whole English interest? Did you get interested in Spanish authors or Mexican or South American culture or something? What led you to want to improve your Spanish?
I had taken French as my reading language for the PhD because you had to have 2 languages. And then I just decided it made sense to do Spanish as a second language because we have more opportunities to use it here and in this hemisphere. So,
Right.
and it was, I don't know if it was French or Spanish that made me just want to, I think it was Spanish that made me realize that when you learn a language, you learn a whole culture. And that was
Okay.
pretty exciting, and it tied in with the opportunities to travel in this hemisphere.
Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, you like to travel, right?
Oh.
So it was actually somewhat independent of your teaching career. You just wanted to expand your Spanish for both travel and just to be able to interact with people and that kind of thing. But it wasn't specifically related to Spanish,
No, I had
studying
no idea that I was
South
gonna-
American authors or anything of that sort.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I love to read them now, but I still read them in translation. My Spanish isn't that good at it.
Okay. So then, I guess now where did you take your PhD? Was that in Greeley?
University of Alabama.
Wow, you went all over the place.
Well, at that point, I was married, and my husband was drilling for natural gas, and they sent him to Alabama. So we had been living in separate places part of the time because of the career differences. He'd been drilling in Wyoming, and so this was an opportunity for us to be together. So we moved to I went to the University of Alabama because that's where he was drilling.
Okay. And so, how did things go with that marriage? That sounds like he's quite a different background than you had. Yeah.
Well, that marriage failed. It lasted for almost 5 years, but yeah, the difference in background, the difference in education levels. He had finished high school, but I had at that point had a couple of relationships with academic men that had failed, and so I think I was sort of reaching out for someone more down to earth, or I'm not sure what. But it was
In
sort
the
of, it
oil.
was rather doomed from the beginning.
Okay. So would you say you sort of made a poor choice there, or how would you characterize it?
Yeah, I made a poor choice, and it was hard for him as well as it was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those things are always easy to see in retrospect. But
Right.
all right. So then you got your degree, PhD in Alabama, and somehow you got back to Greeley to teach.
I had just taken a
And-
leave of absence.
Oh, you're taking a leave of absence, and that's where you went back. Okay. And you wanted to improve your Spanish, so you talked to some agency about, well, describe more about how that worked, how you got to the...
I was just looking for some place where I could have conversation with Spanish speakers, because there are a lot of native Spanish speakers in Colorado. So the organization that people pointed me toward was Catholic Community Services, I think it was called. And they provided diapers and gas and help for migrants and people who were struggling. And they needed someone who could speak Spanish with people, and so that's how it got started. But they also had a Hispanic elderly outreach program for people who were somewhat isolated in their homes and would benefit from having visitors to chat with. And they were almost always totally Spanish speaking. So I met with two families, and one of the women moved away to join a daughter or something shortly after we met. But I stayed friends with the one couple and developed a very close relationship with them.
And that's the couple about the wife of whom you wrote the book.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Okay. So it really started out, your relationship with them was a way to improve your Spanish, and I guess they benefited by having someone, they felt isolated, and they was a way for them to have, you know, talk with someone else and add some variety for their life.
Right. And they weren't completely isolated. They had children there in the town who came over to see them, but I wouldn't call her a social worker, but their representative at the Catholic Community Services felt they would benefit by having some more visits.
Okay. So now you started out and you were having these conversations with the two of them. Somehow you got from there to this idea of writing this book. So how did that all unfold?
Visiting with them was fascinating because the husband loved to talk about history and the books that he had read and politics, and he loved to tell me stories about Pancho Villa and the Revolution, Mexican Revolution, and that sort of thing. And so when I would try to direct a question to her so that I could talk with her equally, he would send her off to the kitchen to get me some juice so that he could continue the conversation. So I didn't get to hear her voice. Well, then in the winter of 90-91, I think it was, he slipped on the ice and fell and broke a hip. He had to go into a nursing home, and he was a big man. He was 6'5", I think, and she was a tiny woman. So there's no way she would have been able to lift him had he fallen again. So he never did come out of the nursing home. He died in the nursing home. But so in the meantime, then I would alternate visits between her, and then I'd go to the nursing home every other week. And by that, he became frailer and frailer, so about the only thing I could do with him was read the Bible to him. But that was kind of good for me because I already knew what it said, so it was easier to read the Spanish, you know. But then when I would go to the house to speak with her, I got to speak with her and hear her stories, and they began to fascinate. She would tell me these interesting stories about what it was like growing up on the ranch in Mexico, and the colorful fiestas that her father would sponsor, and the food they would eat, and they would be up all night, and they would be dancing, and the Indians would be dancing in these colorful costumes, and I thought that was fascinating stuff. So I asked her if she would mind if I wrote it down for her progeny, or her children and grandchildren. She thought that was a pretty good idea, so that's how it started.
Okay. And then somehow you made a transition from the progeny to making it a book that was available to the general public, huh?
Well, I took it to a friend of mine who's sort of a mentor. She was my dean at the time, but she had been a Spanish professor, and she's a Spanish professor again now. And so she was helping me. I asked her if I was getting this down correctly, because I didn't know, my Spanish wasn't very good at that point, so I was trying to write down what she was saying as quickly as I could, and I didn't even know if some of the words were correct, or was this 2 words or 1 word or what. So she found the rustic quality of the language and the stories reminded her so much of what her mother had told her. Her mother was an immigrant from Mexico. Okay. And they just rang some bells for her. She got very excited about it and said, "You must be taping this, you must be taping this." So that's when we started to tape.
All right, well, this is great. This is, we're going to take a break now.
Okay.
This is kind of gets us to where the book begins.
Right.
And so we'll take a break and come back in a couple minutes, and we'll get off of you and more onto the book.
All right.
Okay, we're back again, and now we're going to talk about putting this whole book together, which Joyce did, and she's done it over quite a long period of time. So you got the inspiration to first record this information for her progeny, and then that later unfolded because of your supervisor into something that could be generally available to the whole public. So kind of what sort of techniques or way did you go about doing this recording? You know,
Well, I bought a tape recorder that, and a tape recording machine, and I got a grant from the university for research to do that and some of the other parts of the book. But I just took enough material with me, enough tape with me each time to let her talk for about an hour and a half. And I taped it as I asked her questions. Sometimes I understood what she was saying, and sometimes I didn't, but but I could transcribe it later. And so she talked for about an hour and a half each time we met, unless I had to go earlier. And then I transcribed those tapes myself, and I transcribed them pretty much phonetically because I had to transcribe what I heard. It wasn't necessarily the way it should have looked in written Spanish, but once I wanted to do it so that I would get the experience. Then I took it to my dean, and she helped me put it into acceptable Spanish.
Okay.
Although, of course, it was still a very rural dialect, so there were dialect questions to look at. For example, she would say things like, well, in English it would come out, we ain't done it yet, or that sort of thing. But we left that because that was her register of speaking. So then she helped me get it into reasonably good English, but she ran out of time because she was very busy in her own duties, and she was just doing this out of the goodness of her heart. So then I had the grant, I told you about the research grant, so I was able to hire some graduate students to help me finish the transcriptions. And again, I would write them out first, and then they would correct them with me listening to the tapes.
So the transcription is taking her voice and putting it into written Spanish.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I was
Okay.
doing.
And then you had to make the translation then from Spanish into English.
That was a later step.
Okay, that
Right.
didn't happen at that point.
Right. First we had to get them all down in Spanish and then get them reasonably correct.
Now, I think I heard you say at one point one of the, I guess it was a granddaughter helped you out with some of this.
I finally ran out of grant money, and I still didn't have it done. So I knew her granddaughter from, I had been mentoring a young man that I took to a speech clinic on campus, and this young woman was the secretary in the speech clinic. So she and I began to talk, and so I asked her if she would help me finish transcribing those tapes. And that was wonderful because my graduate students were pretty good in Spanish. They were native speakers, but they didn't always understand what Viviana was saying.
Okay.
Viviana mumbled a little bit, and she had her own, we all have our own speech idiosyncrasies, but her granddaughter knew what she was saying
Yeah,
because
that's
she'd lived
great.
around her grandmother all her life.
All right. Well, that was probably a really
Yes, I owe
nice.
that granddaughter a lot.
Yeah. So then you got the whole thing into Spanish, and the granddaughter got sort of the right thing. Now, you were saying that was still in the sort of the idiom that she spoke, so with the ain'ts and the double negatives or whatever they would be
Right.
called in Spanish.
Right.
You had it all down that way. And then the translation into English, there must have been some difficulties there, just as there are translating any language from one to another. And did you kind of do that on your own, or did you have help with that part of it?
I did that the same way, but then I needed help after I got what I thought was the correct translation on the page. Then I started to work with the granddaughter again.
Okay, so
get
she
that
was
straightened
fluent
out.
in both Spanish and English. All right. So she's your goddaughter or something.
Right.
All right.
Yes.
And now, as I read the book, there's definitely a kind of a colloquialism to the speech, but it seems to be, for the most part, pretty correct English, at least. So I didn't pick that sense of ain'ts and double
No.
negatives and things like that. So you must have made a decision there at some point to put it in that form.
I think every translator with an oral history, and I've read other oral historians have said this, that transcription and translation are kind of an art, and there are a lot of decisions to make about how you want your subject to come across. And I didn't want her to come across as quaint or I didn't want to make her sound, I'm not sure
undignified, or
yes, I think that might be a good way to put it. So I corrected some of those kinds of figures of speech and tried to leave in some of the things that still characterize. You could hear her rural idioms and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I picked it up more in the way she would say something and then she would kind of repeat it again in either exactly the same words or just slightly different. It felt like real speech, you know, as opposed to something that had been cleaned up to the point that it was, you know.
Right. Some of that was just her way of speaking, but some of it also was that she was very conscious that she was my teacher. So she knew I wasn't understanding everything all the time, so she would repeat just to make sure that I got it.
Well, that brings up your whole relationship with her. Obviously, you kind of bonded well with her, and I think your female connection was very important. I doubt that a man could have done this with her.
It would be a totally different story if she'd been
right.
talking to a man.
So what do you think your influence was on terms of how the whole thing came out? It being you and her and your particular relationship, how did that influence the end product?
It definitely is Viviana's life told through Joyce Lackie's interaction with Viviana. If she had told this to her daughter, it would be a different story. If she had told it to her minister's wife, it would be a different story. So she respected me, and she was pleased that someone who had the skills was telling her story and writing it down. But I don't think, another thing that oral historians talk about frequently is the power imbalance, because often the person who's the interviewee has less formal education, or perhaps is working through another language and therefore has a struggle to communicate, doesn't have a high-powered job, that sort of thing. And so who stands to benefit from this? Well, who gets the promotion? Who gets the increase in salary, you know? So there is a power imbalance there, but I think in our case that was ameliorated a little bit just by the fact that we'd become friends before this ever happened. And also, I think she was aware that not only was she my teacher about the language, she was the expert on her life. She was telling me about her life.
Well, and I think probably as important as any of this is that you did all this in Spanish, where she clearly had an advantage over you.
That's right. That's right. That's another one.
So, you know, it was her story, and she was telling it in her language, and you're the, you know, the person who, quote, would profit, unquote, by being able to produce the book. But, you know, you're sitting by her side and sort of, she's the authority.
Yes.
And you are just taking down the information, so to speak.
That was another aspect of that, of the way we did it, that I hadn't planned, but because of the way the furniture was, it was easier to put the tape recorder on the floor so that it wouldn't get knocked around. So I sat at her feet so that I could control both the tape recorder and the microphone that I had on her dress.
Okay.
So I was really the student at her knee.
Yeah. Well, that would definitely have the feeling of, you know, teacher and student at the knee.
And we both liked it. We both felt comfortable doing that.
All right. Well, that's great. So then, let's get around to talking about Viviana herself and the story. Describe her and her upbringing and whatever you want to say about Viviana. Well, not everything. We'll talk about her for the next 17 minutes. But.
Oh, all right, all right. She just did not have a lot of advantages, let's put it that way. She grew up very poor, in the middle of a ranch, in the middle of the mountains, in the middle of Mexico, far away from any major city, far away from resources. She tried to go to school. Her parents sent her for, I think, part of a year. And she felt that she couldn't hold things in her head. She didn't understand why those little zeros on the paper were supposed to make a sound. They didn't make a sound as far as she was concerned. And the other thing that turned her off to school was that she must have been a little older when they sent her, because she had a little brother who came to school at the same time. Her parents, her mother, I shouldn't say her parents, her mother favored the boys. She had 2 younger brothers. And she was the one who was supposed to work hard and babysit those brothers and run the house. She was second in running the house. So the little brother, when he couldn't learn something, the teacher would smack him with the ruler or box him on the ears. And that made her feel powerless, that she couldn't protect her little brother. So she had very negative feelings about school. But she did have, and this is I would compare this to myself, she did have a father who loved her. And she never mentioned her father without kind of a warm glow coming into the conversation. But her mother was pretty abusive. Her mother had high blood pressure, and she would explode, and she threw a fire poker at her once and nearly put it in her eye. And yeah, so that part of her childhood was not exactly wonderful either.
Well, now, how did the parents themselves get along, the mother and father?
She mentioned that they got along very well. Very well. Yeah, they didn't fight. She just describes him as such a gentle man, and also a community leader. And I think that's where she gets some of her strength. He was a foreman, and he didn't make enough to, well, you asked about how much he made to support the family. He had to cut hair on the weekends, and for that they would get tomatoes and chili and whatever the people had.
So they were paid in a barter kind of thing. Okay.
Right. He made more than the other people on the ranch, but it wasn't a lot of money. But what he did was save money each year and sponsor, she called it a pageant, I believe, for the Christmas celebration. And that would be the big celebration of the year, and that was where the Indians were dancing, and the amazing foods that she would write about, and you could just, she could taste them as she was talking about it. And so her father was a very principled person, and that was a strong influence in her life.
It sounds like it, yeah. So that's also probably where, from some of those festivals and maybe helping her mother, who wasn't all that kind to her, that's where she kind of developed her own domestic skills, her cooking particularly.
And sewing. She was a wonderful, she made all the children's clothes, and she had 12 children.
Right. So, that sounds like kind of a mixed childhood, in the sense that a mother that was kind of mean and tough on her, and a father that was loving and supportive. And so then she only went to school, say, for 1 year?
Less than a year.
And the rest of the time she was either helping her mother or involved in farming in some way or other? Or
helping her mother most of the time.
Mostly helping her mother. Okay.
Her father didn't let her out of the house much. When she was a teenager,
he was protective that way.
He was protective. When she was a teenager, the girls would come, if there was going to be a gathering or a dance, the girls could come around to everybody's house and ask if the girls could come, and he almost always said no, she couldn't go.
Sounds like he's a little bit like your mother.
Yeah, he was protecting her.
Okay.
But there's valid reason for that. I was describing to Maria, my dean, who was helping me with this, one of the scenes that she talked about, in which she married an older man. The man who came courting her was 9 years older than she. And she did have some other boyfriends, she told me later, but he threatened her. He was a widower, and he had been known to beat his first wife, but whether that was the cause of her death, she never did say. But he came courting, and he told her more than once that if she didn't marry him, he would come and drag her out, or he would kill her. These are the things she told me. So she was afraid of him, and so she went ahead and made that marriage. Now, she doesn't say why her father let it happen. She said her father didn't approve of him, but I wonder if it was partly her mother's abuse of her that made her feel like she wasn't worthy to have someone better. I don't know that.
Yeah, so that never got clarified in your conversations with her, why she went along. Because, as I read the book, he sounded, Jorge, the man she married, sounded like a really unpleasant person. And yet, somehow, she ended up marrying him, even though it sounded like he never did anything in terms of that was kind of loving towards her. It was always just like threatening her and bullying her. And so she couldn't have particularly liked him, and yet it went ahead and happened. So you think it's because it was maybe part of her the heritage of her mother and sort of just accepting those kind of things, or what?
It's one of the biggest puzzles of the book, I think. Other people have asked me about that. Why did she marry him?
Yeah.
But she insisted whenever that question came up, she was afraid of him. That's all she would say. She didn't have any theory about it being her mother's abuse or anything like that, or her lack of self-confidence. She was afraid of him. That's all she would say.
Did she think perhaps if she married him, that fear would be replaced by something else?
Isn't that interesting? I don't know. I don't know what she thought would happen afterwards. If she had realized what was going to happen afterwards, would she have run? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you also at one point talked about how you think there was some kind of blend of, I think you described it as Native American fatalism and Spanish attitudes towards just enduring or suffering and just sort of staying the course and putting up with it and not getting out of the situation. Do you think that kind of cultural thing had some influence, or was...
You know, the first time I've written this book, I wrote it in several versions before it was actually published, and the first one, I kept looking for a theme that would tie her life events together. Finally, after doing that 3 or 4 times, I decided, well, life doesn't necessarily have a theme. But at that point, I was looking at the concept of aguantar, which means to survive, to struggle with, to put up with, to work through. There's a better word for it in English, and I can't think what it is right now. But that is a part, that does seem to be a part of Mexican culture. But I've read other sources that say, in a sense, they look at that as a strength, that it's not necessarily
it's almost
life
noble,
is,
huh?
Exactly.
Okay.
Everybody struggles, and so to struggle well and to struggle with dignity is a good thing. So life is a struggle. So it's that kind of concept.
All right.
Rather than fatalism is a little too harsh, I think.
So now, how old was she when she married this man?
16.
She's only 16 years old.
16.
And he was considerably older.
He was
is that
20, well, let's see, she might have been 17 because he was 20. She said he was 9 years older than he.
Right? Okay.
So, or he was 9 years older than she.
And so what was life like initially when after they got married? I mean, I know he continued to be abusive, but was he working in agriculture, or what did he do?
He was a worker on the farm. He isolated her, basically. He moved her into his little hut or house, and then wouldn't allow her to go home to see her parents.
Did they live near the parents?
She could have walked.
Really?
And she did a few times, but what happened was there was a neighbor woman who lived near enough to see what she was doing, and she ratted on her.
Oh, jeez.
So she
Nice neighbor, huh?
Yes, she got beaten, and I asked her why. Why that? And she didn't know why. She was just a bad neighbor. You know. But another thing you'll read if you, in background reading on that culture, that patriarchal culture, is that women help perpetuate it.
Yeah, you did talk about how they encourage their sons to be tough on their wives because that's, I guess, just the way things are done, or that's the way you show your macho-ness or whatever.
Sometimes I wonder if that isn't, in the mother's case, a little bit of jealousy too.
Okay.
How dare you love her instead of me? You know?
So she had 12 children. She must have started out pretty quickly to have kids right away, huh? And I think you described in the book how they, at first, were just up in the mountains. He was watching pack mules, I think it was. So describe the living conditions that she had at that time.
Oh my! When he got that job, watching the livestock in the mountains. Well, she was the one who actually watched the livestock. The farmers or the workers would take their wives, and there were some single women too, up to the top part of the mountain ranges, just to keep track of the cattle to see that they didn't wander off. And then the women would be there alone, and the men would go back down and do the other ranch work that needed to be done. But she didn't have a little hut or anything. She describes that when it rained, she would just have to curl up into a ball under a tree because there was no place to get away from the rain. So it wasn't exactly a pleasant
How did
existence.
how did they get food? How did they prepare food in those
Oh,
circumstances?
they brought it up on mules. They brought
Okay.
they brought a mule train up every 2 weeks with enough lime and dough, and for the nixtamal, which is the dough that they make tortillas out of, and just cook over an open fire.
And so they had enough tools to grind the corn?
Yeah,
Okay.
just a little grinder, metate, to grind the.
And then they cooked it on an open fireplace, or, you know. Sounds like a very tough existence. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, first child is born. Is she continuing to live under those conditions, or
Well,
what happened?
I'm not exactly sure how soon they got the first house, because I asked her if, when she became pregnant, did he build her a house. A little hut was what they would have had, and it wouldn't have taken long to build. You'd build it through gathering reeds and mudding those reeds together. And so she describes how they built their house a little bit later on. But at that point, she didn't say that he felt it was necessary to build a house for a pregnant wife. But I think he must have, because then she later on does describe the little huts they would build. They call them hakales.
So that just brings up an issue on the side. How much do you feel she remembered things accurately or told an accurate story and throughout the whole situation? How much you think?
Yeah.
Or what are your questions about that in your own mind?
Every memory is inaccurate, you know, in terms of what someone else might say or the way someone else might see a situation. So I think that she never intentionally deluded me. I think there were things that she recalled very differently than her children, for example, because I got different versions of stories from her children. I think that once in a while she put herself in a good light. In fact, she laughed about that once. She was describing how Jorge was as a grandfather, and he didn't treat the grandchildren right. And then she said, of course, I was a good grandmother, you know, and then she laughed at that. So she knew there were times that she would put herself in a good light.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Well, I just think we're only have so much time, and we have a long way to go here. So we'll fast forward a bit here. She has, I think it was, you said 6 children when she was, or 9 children?
9 when they came to the United States.
Still, okay. And what brought them to that point, to come to the United States?
The Mexican economy at that point, there was no work for people. People with no skills, like her husband, simply couldn't make enough in a week to feed a family of, well, that would have been a family of 11. Not exactly, because the oldest daughter had married by that point. I think she was probably 16 or 17 when she married. So they were feeding 8 children. Okay. But the economy was so poor, and her husband had traveled north once before as a migrant worker, and knew how to get into the United States. And also, he was born in the United States. So he had family somewhere in Texas that he hadn't seen in years. He was taken to Mexico when he was 14. So it was at least, it would have been probably 20 years since he'd had any contact with them. So the idea was to go north and get a living wage to feed those children.
Okay. So once they crossed over, they did not come back. Is that correct?
Right, that's right.
And at first they were in Texas, and then I guess the work wasn't adequate or not enough there. It was seasonal, and like picking cotton, was that what he was doing? Or
orchards. The first job was in the orchards, the fruit orchards, picking fruit and irrigating the fruit.
All right.
That they found his family, and his sister-in-law was a contractor, and so the sister-in-law helped them move back and forth along the migrant trails, and then eventually find a spot in Colorado where they could get full-time work.
Okay. So they went up to Colorado, and for a while they went back and forth a few times, but then they settled in Colorado. By that time she had 12 children, right? And several miscarriages thrown in there. And there's a lot of things we're not going to be fully able to cover here, but one of the things you talked about was that he not only was abusive, but he was a bit of a philanderer too. And he wanted to actually, when they were in Mexico, to get out of the marriage.
Right.
But she was so strong about her children and her commitment to the children. She just felt that she could never do that, and it
Right.
was almost as much, not only is it her responsibility, I think she felt like it was his responsibility too, to, you know, keep the children and not break the marriage up. Is that
Yes,
true?
if there was anything I want people to take away from this book, it would be the sense of how a strong person works through a lot of adverse conditions. And I think she felt from the time she married, she had a certain role to fulfill. This is what you do to be a good wife and a good mother. That's what I will do. That's the code she lived by in Mexico. That's the code she lived by in the United States. And that says a lot about immigrants in this country, I think. I think that's the strong ethic throughout
And
immigrant populations.
another theme that you say was a very important one, we haven't talked really about at all, is her the importance of religion and God in her thinking. So that was probably a big sustaining thing
I
for
think,
her.
yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Even when she was alone, living alone after her husband had gone into the nursing home, her Diosito, her God, was right there beside her. She was never alone.
Joyce, unfortunately, we haven't had enough time to really cover this as much. That's my fault. I didn't judge the time properly. But anyone who is interested in finding out more about this should read this book. It's available in the Multnomah Library System, and of course you can always buy it too. And there's lots more that we haven't covered at all. So I want to thank you, Joyce, for doing this. And I want to acknowledge Don and the PSAs that he normally would include at the end of the show. And we're not going to be doing those tonight because we're chock-a-block full with everything we talked about. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed the show.